So here we are, Mount Olympus, the divine penthouse suite of the ancient world. Picture a mountain that stretches so high you can't quite see the top. Clouds roll around it like fluffy bodyguards, and supposedly, way up past the fog, the gods have their apartments, not literal apartments with doorbells and grumpy landlords, but in some ways, it's not too far off. The myths often describe Olympus as this paradise where everything is perfect. Meals appear out of nowhere, music is always playing, and the air is light and golden. But if you look a little closer, you realise it sounds less like heaven and more like one very dysfunctional neighbourhood. Imagine the hallway noise complaints. You've got Zeus throwing lightning bolts when he gets cranky, Hera pacing around plotting her next jealous retaliation, Apollo practicing his lyre too loudly, and Ares probably punching the drywall. If you have ever lived in a dorm, you get the vibe. Olympus was supposed to be this timeless, serene palace, but it feels more like a divine soap opera trapped in a never-ending cycle of awkward dinners and backstabbing. Historically speaking, the Greeks genuinely did believe Mount Olympus was a real place where their gods hung out. They didn't see it as a symbolic spiritual realm the way later religions might frame divine homes. For them, Olympus was a literal address, the godly equivalent of, yeah, they're up there in that mountain house. Don't bother them unless you want trouble. Of course, scholars debate whether common folks actually thought Zeus was physically lounging on a golden recliner up there, or if it was more of a poetic metaphor. Still, ancient pilgrims sometimes climbed Olympus itself, maybe squinting at the clouds, hoping to catch a glimpse of divine neighbours. Spoiler, no one ever did. Here's the quirky part. The myths describe Olympus as a place where nobody ever ages, and nothing ever breaks down. The gods didn't need Netflix or TikTok to stay entertained. They had nectar and ambrosia, the food and drink of immortality. Some stories say that ambrosia was honey-like, others imagine it more like wine, but the important thing is, it kept the gods glowing and basically unkillable. If you're picturing an eternal buffet table where Zeus loads his plate with lightning bolt-shaped cookies, while Hermes sneaks desserts into his pocket, you're not too far off. It's easy to imagine the gods hanging around in what sounds like an eternal cruise ship dining room, slightly bored but unwilling to admit it. And that's where Olympus gets interesting. Because if you think about it, immortality sounds amazing. No bills, no dentist appointments, no forgetting your phone charger. But it also means endless time to be annoyed at your relatives. You know those family reunions where someone brings up politics, and suddenly you're wishing you'd never agreed to show up? Now imagine that reunion lasts for all eternity. That's Olympus. Every god has their own personality quirks, their rivalries, their grudges, and the whole place is essentially a cosmic HOA that never adjourns. Some myths describe the palace halls glittering with marble columns, embroidered couches, and streams of sunlight that never fade. That sounds idyllic, but imagine trying to nap there while Apollo insists on rehearsing harp solos at full volume. The reality is, Olympus probably felt less like a perfect realm and more like the world's fanciest open office. No privacy, way too many egos, and constant drama about who sat where at dinner. Now, here's something fun. Scholars still argue about whether the idea of Olympus evolved from real places. Some say the myths drew from Minoan palaces, with their fancy frescoes and banquet halls, which regular people could barely imagine. Others argue Olympus was a purely mythical construct, more dream palace than architectural inspiration. And then there's the fringe idea. What if Olympus was meant to be above the clouds, because that's where storms come from? Zeus hurling lightning doesn't sound random if you imagine that him stomping around upstairs in the storm factory. You can almost hear Hera sighing, Zeus, not again, every time thunder rolled across the valleys. So as you drift deeper into the story, picture Olympus not as some untouchable paradise, but as a noisy, glowing apartment building where nobody ever dies and nobody ever shuts up. Zeus storms, Hera glares, Hermes sneaks out, Dionysus throws another party. It's chaotic, it's petty, and somehow it's eternal. If you're feeling sleepy already, good, that's the trick. The gods might be immortal, but your eyelids definitely aren't. If you thought Olympus was allowed in general, now imagine living directly under Zeus, the guy who literally owned thunder as his personal sound system. Zeus isn't just the so-called king of the gods, he's also the universe's most unpredictable weather app. Instead of checking tomorrow's forecast, ancient Greeks just assumed Zeus was in a mood. Sunshine, he's happy. Sudden storm, somebody irritated him. Full-blown lightning storm, yeah. Either immortals swore an oath they didn't keep, or Zeus lost at Divine Poker Night. You can picture him stomping around the palace, beard slightly frizzed from static electricity, with a collection of lightning bolts tucked under one arm like darts. Every bolt was supposedly crafted by the Cyclopes, giant one-eyed blacksmiths who must have been very patient with Zeus, constantly demanding just one more. It's like having that friend who keeps asking you to sharpen pencils, but the pencils are weapons of mass destruction. Here's the straightforward historical fact. Zeus started off as a sky god inherited from older Indo-European traditions. He was essentially Sky Father, a type of deity you can also find in Roman, Norse and Hindu traditions. The Greeks just gave him a flashier personality, equal parts stern father figure, party host and wandering troublemaker. His favourite trick was punishing mortals for lying under oath. If you swore falsely, Zeus was believed to send a thunderbolt your way. Imagine trying to bluff your way through a poker game when the dealer has unlimited lightning strikes. Yeah, you'd fold fast. But then there's the quirky side. Did you know Zeus supposedly had an eagle sidekick who acted like his delivery driver? The eagle would carry his thunderbolts, kind of like Uber Eats but with more firepower. Some myths even describe the eagle as practically his emotional support animal, always nearby, always circling. You can imagine Zeus pacing the marble halls, hurling lightning outside while the eagle just sits there like, buddy, maybe hydrate, maybe chill. Now scholars do debate how much people actually thought Zeus was just a thunder machine versus a complex moral overseer. Was he more like a cosmic policeman keeping people honest, or simply the personification of loud, scary storms? Some argue that farmers genuinely believed Zeus cared whether they were honest in contracts, while others suggest that he was mainly a mythological excuse for natural disasters. Like, oh, the olive grove burned down. Must have been Zeus having a tantrum again. If you stretch your imagination a little, you can almost hear what living under Zeus would have been like. Imagine drifting off to sleep in some Greek village when, boom, he decides to rehearse his thunder rolls at 2 a.m. The kids wake up screaming, the goats scatter, and someone mutters, Zeus really needs to pick a better hobby. And yet, despite all the chaos, people respected him deeply. They built temples, held festivals, and lit fires to keep him happy. Because if the guy upstairs controls lightning, you're probably going to send him a few thank you notes. Picture it, Olympian banquet night. Everyone's at the long table. Hera gives Zeus that infamous side-eye because he's been a little too friendly with a mortal again. Apollo strums nervously. Dionysus has already opened the second barrel of wine. Zeus, trying to assert his authority, slams a thunderbolt into the table, not to hurt anyone, just to make a point. Everyone pretends to laugh, but secretly they're thinking, please don't short-circuit the ambrosia machine again. Of course, Zeus wasn't all noise. He was also credited with keeping some order in a very unruly universe. According to myth, he overthrew his dad, Cronus, who had this nasty habit of swallowing his children whole. After Zeus defeated him, he freed his siblings and set up a new regime. So technically, thunder tantrums aside, he was the guy who made sure gods could hang out in Olympus instead of inside their father's stomach. That's progress. Still, every good bedtime story needs a little weirdness, and with Zeus, the weirdness is endless. The man, well God, couldn't stop shapeshifting to sneak around. One day he's a swan, the next a bull, then a shower of golden rain. Yes, golden rain. Because apparently being king of the gods wasn't enough. He also wanted to cosplay as every farm animal in the book. Scholars still argue about whether those tales were symbolic fertility stories or just ancient writers getting very creative with excuses. Either way, it makes his thunder tantrum seem almost normal by comparison. So next time you hear thunder rolling outside your window, imagine it's Zeus, pacing Olympus in his sandals, grumbling about someone lying under oath, or maybe Hera giving him the cold shoulder again. Lightning splits the sky, not because of some meteorological explanation, but because the king of the gods is in one of his moods. And honestly, that's more entertaining than checking your weather app anyway. Now that Zeus has finished rattling the heavens with his thunder tantrums, we should probably talk about the one person who never seemed impressed. Hera. Picture her sitting across from him at the Olympian dinner table, chin in hand, eyes narrowed into that long, unblinking stare that only someone who's already rehearsed the argument in her head can give. Hera wasn't just Zeus's wife, she was also his sister, which is, let's say, awkward, even by ancient myth standards. But don't get distracted, her real defining quality was suspicion. If Olympus had a neighbourhood watch, she'd be the one running it. clipboard in hand, glaring over her ambrosia cup, absolutely sure somebody was misbehaving. Historically, Hera was worshipped as a powerful goddess of marriage and family. She had major temples in places like Argos and Samos, where people celebrated her with processions, sacrifices, and festivals. To her followers, she wasn't some jealous sitcom character. She was the divine protector of vows, the glue that held communities together. But myths written later down the line did her dirty, painting her mostly as Zeus's perpetually angry spouse. Think of it as the original bad reality TV edit. And here's the quirky part. Some scholars argue Hera actually began as a fertility goddess, older and bigger than Zeus in certain traditions. In fact, in a few local myths, she might have been worshipped before Zeus even made it to the spotlight. But as time passed, the myths shifted, shrinking her role until she became the one who keeps yelling at Zeus. You can imagine her irritation at that narrative twist. Imagine being the cosmic CEO, and suddenly you're rewritten as the jealous partner in somebody else's soap opera. The debates about Hera never stop. Was she really meant to embody the ideal of marriage? Noble, protective, unwavering, or was she more of a warning tale about how destructive jealousy could be? Some scholars even suggest the ancient Greeks themselves were conflicted about her, which is why she comes across so differently depending on who's telling the story. In one place, she's revered as the Divine Mother. In another, she's the sharp-tongued antagonist giving Zeus ulcers. But myths love the drama, and Hera had plenty. Anytime Zeus started shape-shifting his way into another mortal romance, whether as a swan, a bull, or a suspicious cloud, Hera wasn't far behind, furious but clever. Instead of going after Zeus directly, she often turned her wrath on the poor mortals he courted, or on their children. The hero Heracles? That's Zeus's son, and Hera's lifelong enemy. She once sent snakes into his crib just to make sure the baby didn't get too comfortable. Unfortunately for her, baby Heracles strangled the snakes like chew toys, which must have made family dinners incredibly awkward. Imagine Olympus at night. Zeus comes home late, trying to sneak in quietly after another business trip. Hera's waiting in the atrium, arms crossed, eagle-eyed, tapping her sandal. You can almost hear the argument echoing through the golden halls. Really, Zeus? A swan again? Do you think I wouldn't notice? The rest of the gods are in their rooms, pretending to sleep, wishing Zeus would keep it down and Hera would just let it slide for once. But of course she never does. Suspicion was practically her brand. And yet, Hera wasn't all scowls and vendettas. She was also associated with renewal and protection. Some stories describe her bathing in a sacred spring every year to restore her virginity. Talk about a magical reset button. It's a detail that feels both majestic and oddly domestic, like even the Queen of the Gods needed a spa day to recharge. In Argos, people celebrated her as a life-giving force tied to the rhythms of nature. So while Homer might paint her as Zeus's nagging partner, local worshippers saw her as something grander, almost cosmic. The quirky side continues with her symbols. Peacocks were sacred to her, bright, dramatic birds that strut like they own the place. Perfect match, right? One myth says the eyes on their feathers came from Argus, the 100-eyed watchman she once employed to spy for her. After his death, she honoured him by putting his many eyes on her favourite bird. So yes, even her pets were basically security cameras. So picture Hera as the goddess who never lets her guard down. She's suspicious, yes, but also fiercely protective and willing to let chaos unravel her version of order. While Zeus thundered, she planned. While the other gods partied, she watched. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. After all, if no one kept Zeus in check, the whole mountain might have crumbled under his hobbies. Hera's side-eye, eternal and unyielding, was less about pettiness and more about survival. At least that's one way to tell it. So we've sat with Hera's eternal suspicion for a while, but let's shuffle down Olympus's noisy hallway and knock on the door of her brother Poseidon, the god who basically treated the ocean like his personal mood ring. If Zeus was thunderstorms and fireworks, Poseidon was the deep, salty rumble underneath it all, ruling over the seas with a trident in hand and what can only be described as permanent saltwater mood swings. Historically, Poseidon was a big deal, especially for coastal Greeks whose entire livelihoods depended on boats, fishing, and not being randomly swallowed by waves. Sailors prayed to him constantly, tossing sacrifices into the water before setting off, because nobody wanted to be caught in the middle of his temper tantrums. To the average fisherman, Poseidon wasn't just a myth. He was the difference between a safe return home and being a cautionary tale. Here's the odd little quirk. In some early traditions, Poseidon wasn't originally the god of the sea at all. Some scholars argue he may have started as an earth deity, maybe tied to earthquakes. In fact, one of his nicknames was Earthshaker. That's not just poetic. People really believed he caused earthquakes by jabbing his trident into the ground whenever he felt cranky. Imagine you're sitting down to dinner and suddenly the earth trembles. Oh, don't worry, that's just Poseidon poking the floor again. And here's where the debate comes in. Was Poseidon mainly a sea god who picked up earthquakes as a side gig? Or was he originally an earthshaker who later got promoted to run the oceans? Scholars aren't totally sure. Either way, you can picture him pacing the shoreline, stabbing his trident into the sand when someone annoyed him, waves crashing dramatically like a theatre soundtrack. Poseidon's personality in myths is, let's call it, complicated. He was jealous of Zeus's thunderbolts, resentful that Hades got the mysterious underworld, and constantly trying to expand his turf. He once challenged Athena for control of Athens. To win over the people, he struck the ground with his trident and made a salty spring appear. Useful if you're craving seawater, but not exactly practical. Athena countered with an olive tree, shade, food, oil, wood. The Athenians politely chose her gift, and Poseidon probably sulked for a century. That's basically the vibe. Dramatic gestures, followed by disappointment. But don't picture him as just a sore loser. Poseidon had his fair share of admirers too. His sea palace was supposedly breathtaking, made of coral and pearls, with dolphins escorting him like underwater chauffeurs. He married Aphrodite, a sea goddess who was not amused at his flirtations with mortals. There seems to be an Olympian theme. Together they had sea children, including Triton, a merman who liked blowing a conch shell to calm or stir the waves. You can almost hear it now, a deep echoing horn across the ocean. Poseidon sighing as he finally chills out for 5 minutes. Quirky fact time. Poseidon was also credited with creating horses. Yes, horses. The myths say he struck the earth, and horses sprang out, sleek, snorting, ready to run. Why would the sea god invent land animals? Scholars shrug. Some think it's because waves look like galloping horses. Others believe Poseidon was once connected to horse cults before he became Mr. Ocean. Either way, it's fun to imagine Poseidon at a design workshop. Okay, I'll make something fast, with 4 legs, and I guess a mane that looks kind of like waves. Of course, being Poseidon, he didn't just invent horses. He also cursed them sometimes, like in the myth of the winged horse Pegasus, who was born when Perseus chopped off Medusa's head. Poseidon had been involved with Medusa once, don't ask, and Pegasus popped out as one of the consequences. It's messy, honestly. All Poseidon stories are messy. So picture him not as a noble Poseidon statue in a museum, but as a grumpy older brother stomping around, trident in hand, yelling at mortals and sulking whenever Athena wins another popularity contest. His waves crash like slammed doors. His storms roar like shouted arguments. And yet he always calms down eventually. The sea sparkles, dolphins leap, and mortals breathe again until the next tantrum. Living under Zeus was loud, but living near Poseidon was terrifyingly unpredictable. And somehow both brothers kept the world spinning. After wading through Poseidon's salty mood swings, you wander toward a gentler presence on an Olympus, or at least gentler until you bring up her missing daughter. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, the fields, and basically your entire dinner plate was the Olympian, who cared less about storms and wars and more about whether the barley was tall enough to grind into bread. She's that divine aunt who always shows up to gatherings with casseroles, insists you eat seconds, and sighs dramatically when you say you're cutting carbs. Historically, Demeter's worship was widespread and very practical. Farmers across Greece depended on her blessings for fertile soil and abundant crops. Festivals in her honour were massive, like the Thesmophoria, a women-only ritual that involved secret ceremonies, sacrifices, and prayers for fertility of both land and people. She was the goddess who made sure spring returned each year, a promise that the cycle of planting and harvest would keep turning. To ancient communities, Demeter wasn't boring, she was survival. Without her, no bread, no beer, no breakfast porridge. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some myths say Demeter invented the first kind of comfort food. When her daughter Persephone was kidnapped by Hades and dragged into the underworld, Demeter wandered the earth in grief. She disguised herself as an old woman, refused to eat ambrosia, and instead asked for a simple drink called kykeon, made of barley, water, and mint. Not exactly five-star dining, but it became a sacred drink in her rites. You can imagine her, divine but depressed, sipping her minty barley smoothie while glaring at Zeus for letting the whole kidnapping happen. Scholars debate whether Demeter's myths were originally about agriculture at all. Some argue she began as a mother goddess much older than Olympus itself, later folded into the Olympian family for convenience. Others suggest the Persephone story is less about actual kidnapping and more about explaining the seasons. Persephone goes underground for a few months, winter. Demeter sulks and lets the crops die. Then Persephone returns, spring, and Demeter throws the greatest garden party in history. Whether it's symbolic myth or divine soap opera, it gave people a way to understand why fields turn brown and then green again. You can picture Demeter's personality as steady but a little dramatic. On a good day she's glowing, fields buzzing with bees, olive trees dripping with fruit and granaries bursting. On a bad day she shuts the whole system down. Remember that time she was grieving Persephone? She stopped crops from growing entirely, which nearly starved out humanity until Zeus finally negotiated with Hades to send Persephone back part-time. Talk about holding the planet hostage until you get what you want. Demeter could have written the original terms and conditions for agriculture. And let's not forget her connection to Eleusis, where her mystery cult flourished for centuries. People travelled from all over Greece to take part in secret ceremonies dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, promising them some kind of hope for life after death. Nobody really knows what happened inside those rituals, because initiates were sworn to secrecy under threat of death. Scholars still argue about whether they involved psychedelic brews, dramatic reenactments, or simply group meditation. Whatever it was, the cult lasted nearly 1,000 years, which is a pretty good Yelp review for an ancient ritual. Demeter also had a knack for punishing mortals who disrespected her. There's this story about a prince named Stellio who laughed at her for drinking her barley smoothie too greedily. She didn't laugh back, she turned him into a lizard. Imagine sipping your drink, snorting at the goddess, and suddenly you're scurrying under a rock. Classic Demeter move, quiet, petty, and permanent. Still, in between lizard curses and seasonal sulks, Demeter was one of the few Olympians who actually seemed to care about mortals. While Zeus played weather roulette and Poseidon invented earthquakes out of boredom, Demeter gave humans bread. She offered them the basics of life, the same way a tired parent makes sure everyone's fed before worrying about the drama. You can almost hear her muttering, "Eat something, you'll feel better," while storms rage and wars unfold in the background. So imagine her as the warm, flower-dusted goddess of Olympus, apron slightly singed from the hearth, hands always busy with seeds and stalks. She doesn't chase scandal or glory, just stability, until something shakes her family. And then, she'll let the entire world starve before she lets anyone take her daughter again. If Zeus is the tantrum and Poseidon is the sulk, Demeter is the quiet but terrifying hunger strike. Somehow, that made her one of the most powerful gods of all. After lingering in Demeter's grain fields, you wander down another Olympian hallway, this one decorated with helmets, shields, and curiously owl feathers. This is Athena's domain, and unlike Zeus with his thunderbolts or Poseidon with his waves, Athena doesn't waste energy on tantrums. She's calm, sharp, and always 2 moves ahead, like that one chess opponent who smiles because they know you're already doomed. If Olympus had a corporate office, Athena would be the one in the corner cubicle with colour-coded files, sipping black coffee at 4 a.m, and still managing to win every argument. Historically, Athena was worshipped as the goddess of wisdom, strategy, and practical crafts. Her temple, the Parthenon in Athens, wasn't just a tourist photo op. It was the ultimate flex, a giant marble thank you card for the goddess who supposedly gifted the Athenians their olive tree. With olives, they had oil for lamps, food, and trade. That one act secured her the city and cemented her reputation as the goddess of good ideas. Imagine Poseidon's reaction, salty as ever, while Athena coolly placed an olive branch on the table and said, "Checkmate." But here's the quirky part. Athena was also credited with inventing a few very unstrategic things, like the flute. According to myth, she crafted the instrument, tried it out, and then tossed it away in disgust because she didn't like the way her cheeks puffed up while playing. That's Athena in a nutshell. Genius at battle tactics, a little vain about appearances. You can imagine her frowning into a mirror, muttering, "Nope, not worth it," and leaving the flute for some mortal to pick up. Scholars still argue about Athena's origins. Was she originally a local goddess of war and weaving who got absorbed into Olympian myth? Or was she always this pan-Greek figure of intellect? Some even suggest she reflects earlier Near Eastern goddesses repackaged for very Greek audiences, and then there's the classic debate about her birth. Supposedly, she burst fully grown and armoured from Zeus's forehead after he swallowed her pregnant mother, Demeter. That story is either the ultimate migraine metaphor or a symbolic way of saying wisdom comes from the mind. Scholars shrug. Either way, Zeus probably needed Tylenol afterward. Personality-wise, Athena was not one for sloppy brawls. While her half-brother Ares charged into battle screaming, "Fight me!" Athena preferred strategy, ambush, and clever defences. She was the general who studied maps, checked the weather, and packed snacks before leaving camp. If war was chaos, Athena was the calm voice whispering, "Let's not waste troops smashing into that wall like idiots." That's why heroes like Odysseus adored her, because she gave them the brains to survive long after the bravado ran out. Still, Athena wasn't all serious business. Her sacred owl gave her an air of mystery and maybe a little comedy. Imagine an entire city seeing owls as wise, just because Athena liked them. If she'd picked squirrels instead, we'd probably be decorating libraries with golden squirrels today. The owl perched on her shoulder supposedly saw in the dark, symbolising foresight and wisdom. In reality, owls mostly cough up mouse pellets, but it's nice branding. Quirky fact, she was also a goddess of crafts, especially weaving. But if you challenged her, not a good idea. The mortal Arachne learned that the hard way. Arachne wove tapestries so beautiful that Athena herself got jealous. Instead of congratulating her, Athena turned her into the first spider, doomed to weave forever. That's how the Greeks explained cobwebs. So next time you walk into a spider web, remember, that's just Athena flexing her pettiness through poor Arachne's descendants. The debates don't end there. Some scholars argue Athena was actually a virgin goddess because she embodied independence and intellect, not because the Greeks thought she had no interest in romance. Others take her celibacy more literally, seeing her as a rare female figure in myth who never had to define herself through relationships. Either way, her refusal to marry or dally set her apart on Olympus. While Zeus and Hera argued and Poseidon sulked, Athena stayed above it as if to say, some of us actually have work to do. So picture her at an Olympian dinner, helmet neatly polished, owl blinking at the chaos around the table. Zeus is pounding thunderbolts like a toddler with drumsticks, Hera's glaring daggers, Dionysus is already tipsy, and Poseidon's grumbling about his latest territorial loss. Athena sits quietly, probably doodling battle maps on her napkin, prepared to fix whatever catastrophe comes next. Calm, strategic, and maybe just a little smug. Honestly, she might be the only Olympian you'd actually want as your roommate. Slide a little further down the Olympian corridor, past Athena's shelves of war manuals and owl feathers, and you arrive at a room where everything glows just a bit too brightly. That's Apollo's corner, sunlight bouncing off polished lyres, golden arrows stacked like trophies, and probably a vanity mirror in every corner. If Zeus was noise and Athena was strategy, Apollo was style, swagger, and a whole lot of side hustles. God of the sun, music, healing, plague, prophecy, poetry, and probably anything else left over. Apollo is basically the divine overachiever who won't stop talking about his personal brand. Historically, Apollo was one of the most widely worshipped gods in Greece, and not just for his looks. His sanctuary at Delphi was the beating heart of Greek religion, home of the oracle who mumbled cryptic predictions while sitting over a mysterious fissure in the earth. People travelled from every corner of the ancient world to ask him questions. Should I go to war? Should I plant more olives? Should I dump my boyfriend? The oracle would reply with riddles so vague you could interpret them however you liked. Scholars still debate whether the Pythia's trances came from actual hallucinogenic gases seeping out of the ground or just clever stagecraft. Either way, Apollo got the credit. But here's the quirky bit. Apollo wasn't always tied to the sun. In early traditions, he was more of a god of plagues and archery, wandering the countryside with his silver bow. The sun god role came later, possibly influenced by associations with Helios, the actual sun titan. So technically, Apollo didn't start out as Mr. Sunshine. He picked up the job later like a side gig. You can imagine the divine job interview. So Apollo, we've noticed you like light and brightness. How about running the sun? And Apollo, already strumming his lyre, nodding, yeah, that fits my aesthetic. Scholars wrestle with his contradictions. Was Apollo the bright and civilized god of rationality? or the terrifying bringer of plague who shot invisible arrows of sickness. In the Iliad, he sides with the Trojans, sending disease into the Greek camp when they insult one of his priests. Not exactly cheerful sunbeam behaviour. Yet at the same time, he's associated with healing, temples and medicine. He gives you the fever and the cure, like a cosmic pharmacy with questionable customer service. And then there's his ego. Apollo's myths are full of contests, because apparently being a god wasn't enough. He needed to prove he was better at everything. He once competed in a music duel against a satyr named Marsyas, who had the nerve to think his flute could rival Apollo's lyre. Apollo won, of course, but instead of shaking hands, he flayed Marsyas alive. That's the myth equivalent of throwing your guitar pick into the crowd and then setting the stage on fire. Not exactly graceful in victory. Still, Apollo had a softer side, sort of. He was linked with order, harmony, and the beauty of well-played notes. His sacred animal was the swan, which is graceful until it hisses at you. He also had laurel leaves as his emblem, thanks to the nymph Daphne, who transformed into a tree to escape his advances. Apollo, rather than taking the hint, declared the laurel tree sacred and started wearing crowns of its leaves. That's right, his fashion accessory was basically a rejection souvenir. Another quirky detail, Apollo had a twin, Artemis, goddess of the hunt. They were born on the island of Delos, children of Zeus and Leto, after Hera tried to prevent Leto from giving birth anywhere on land. Delos, being a floating island, counted as not land and got the job. You can almost picture Hera grumbling, "Fine, technicality, but I'll allow it." Twins, sunlight and moonlight, harmony and wilderness. Apollo and Artemis were a package deal, though Apollo always seemed to hog the spotlight. Imagine Apollo at an Olympian dinner. Golden hair glowing unnaturally, lyre perched casually in his lap, ready to strum at any moment. Hera sighs, "Not another song, Apollo." Dionysus claps anyway. Zeus pretends not to be jealous. Athena eyes him like she's calculating the odds of silencing him with strategy. And Apollo, he just smiles, because in his mind the whole mountain is his stage, and every thunderclap is just applause. If Apollo's golden glow felt a little overwhelming, you only have to step outside and follow the trail of paw prints, pine needles and moonlight to find his twin sister Artemis. Where Apollo loved applause, Artemis preferred quiet forests, the rustle of deer, and the occasional dramatic sprint under the stars. She's basically the Olympian who RSVP'd no to every family dinner, choosing instead to camp eternally in the wilderness with her pack of nymphs. Picture her tent pitched on some misty hill, bow always ready, side-eyeing anyone who dared disturb her peace. Historically, Artemis was adored as the goddess of hunting, wild animals, and young women. Her shrines weren't just in lonely forests. Her temple at Ephesus was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, bigger than a football field and bristling with columns. To her worshippers, she wasn't just a recluse with a bow, she was protector of childbirth and fertility, an odd pairing with her fierce virginity. It's as if she said, "I'm not into romance myself, but I'll make sure you survive yours." Here's a quirky story. Artemis was so protective of her solitude that even accidental trespassers didn't stand a chance. Poor Actaeon, a hunter, stumbled upon her bathing in a forest spring. Artemis, not thrilled at being spied on, transformed him into a stag. His own hunting dogs, failing to recognize their master, tore him apart. Moral of the story? Respect campsite privacy. Scholars debate whether this myth reflects ancient anxieties about seeing a goddess in her raw, natural power, or whether it's just a cautionary tale told around campfires by dads warning teenage sons, "Don't go creeping in the woods." Another debate swirls around Artemis's character. Was she the compassionate guardian of women and animals, or a merciless huntress who lashed out at anyone crossing her boundaries? Myths give both versions. She once demanded the sacrifice of Agamemnon's daughter Iphigenia because he killed a sacred deer. Yet in another telling, she spared the girl and whisked her away to serve as a priestess. Even scholars can't agree if she's tender or terrifying. Maybe she's both. The moonlight that guides you safely home, and the shadow that makes you trip if you stray too far. Artemis's virginity was central to her identity. But unlike Athena, hers was wrapped in wild independence. She wasn't the strategist in armour, but the runner with bow in hand, deer bounding at her side. She made vows with her father, Zeus, to never be forced into marriage. In return, she received eternal youth and freedom. Picture her glaring across the Olympian table, watching Aphrodite flirt and Hera fume. then rolling her eyes and slipping away to the woods where everything made more sense. Quirky fact: Artemis was also linked to sudden deaths of women in childbirth or to illnesses that struck without warning. It sounds grim, but the idea was that she was so close to the cycle of life that she also hovered at its edges. In some stories she even helped her mother, Leto, deliver Apollo when they were born, making her both midwife and huntress, comforter and killer. That duality puzzled scholars then and now. Was she a gentle guardian or an unpredictable storm in silver sandals? And while Apollo hogged the spotlight at banquets, you can picture Artemis barely attending. If she showed up at all, she'd sit in the corner with a plate of venison, awkward, her dogs at her feet, listening to Apollo's lyre while plotting her next moonlit trek. The Olympians probably knew better than to tease her. After all, this was the goddess who turned Gorkas into venison snacks. Even Ares, noisy as he was, probably kept his distance. So imagine Artemis as the eternal camper, sleeping under stars wrapped in silver light, bow across her lap. She's serene, but if you disturb her quiet, if you break the rules, she'll remind you why the forest has always been both sanctuary and snare. She isn't interested in Olympus's endless drama. She's the silence between arguments, the cool breath of night, the soft but firm warning: don't mess with the huntress. From Artemis's quiet, moonlit campsite, you stumble back into the chaos of Olympus and practically run into the sound of clanging armor and someone shouting, "Fight me on Rebt." Congratulations, you found Ares, the god of war, tantrums, and bloodlust. If Athena is the chess grandmaster of battles, Ares is the guy who flips the board, headbutts the opponent, and calls it a victory. He wasn't about subtle strategy. He was about the thrill of smashing skulls, waving spears, and generally making everyone else on Olympus roll their eyes. Historically, Ares didn't have the same love from mortals that Athena did. In fact, many Greeks thought he was more of a necessary evil than a beloved protector. Sparta liked him, of course, because their entire brand was war. But elsewhere, not so much. People prayed to Ares not because they adored him, but because they hoped he wouldn't show up on their battlefield. He was the human embodiment of chaos and rage, the side of war that nobody wanted but everyone feared. Quirky fact: Ares had a couple of companions who really underline his personality. He was often shown riding into battle with Phobos, fear, and Deimos and terror. Yes, literal personifications of panic and dread. Imagine having two kids named Anxiety Attack and Nightmare. They later lent their names to Mars's moons, which is fitting since the Romans basically turned Ares into Mars and gave him a massive PR glow-up. While the Greeks saw Ares as reckless, the Romans framed Mars as disciplined and honourable. Same guy, different marketing department. Scholars debate why the Greeks disliked Ares so much compared to other war gods. Some think it's because they valued balance and strategy, which Athena embodied, while Ares was raw, unfiltered violence. Others suggest his myths were intentionally unflattering, turning him into a cautionary tale of what happens when rage controls you. He's the ancient equivalent of that guy who smashes beer bottles in the parking lot after losing a soccer game. And yet, despite all the ridicule, Ares still had a weird magnetism. He was constantly entangled in affairs, most famously with Aphrodite. Their fling became the most infamous scandal on Olympus, exposed when her husband Hephaestus caught them in a golden net mid-embrace and invited the whole pantheon to laugh at them. Imagine being roasted at a family dinner by 30 relatives while stuck in handcuffs you can't break. Ares probably never lived that down. But Ares' energy wasn't always useless. In myth, he sometimes played the role of divine muscle, the god you call when you actually need raw power. Heroes like Heracles fought him, sure, but he also symbolized the necessary brutality of battle, because sometimes wars aren't about strategy, they're about survival. The Greeks may not have liked him much, but they couldn't pretend he didn't exist. There's also the weird fact that Ares was sometimes worshipped in chains. Yes, actual chained statues of the god, as if to say, "We honour you, but please, for the love of all olives, stay put." It's both reverence and containment, like building a shrine to a volcano while hoping it never erupts again. Scholars still argue whether those cult practices were meant to pacify him or symbolically keep his destructive energy under control. Picture him at an Olympian banquet. Athena's calmly explaining a battle plan, Apollo's strumming his lyre, and Ares is pounding his fist on the table shouting, "Boring! Let's just fight already!" Dionysus is laughing, Hera is glaring, Zeus is sighing, and Hephaestus is probably grinning, waiting for a chance to bring up that whole net incident again. Ares, meanwhile, is too busy flexing his biceps to care. So you think of Ares not as a noble war god, but as Olympus's loudest troublemaker, it starts to make sense. He's the heat of the battlefield, the smell of iron and blood, the adrenaline that makes soldiers reckless. Necessary, but not exactly pleasant. If Athena is the general you'd follow into war, Ares is the chaotic friend you regret inviting to the bar fight. But somehow, he always shows up anyway. If you thought Ares was exhausting, just wait until you slide your chair down the banquet table to Aphrodite, the goddess who could start a scandal just by showing up. Where Ares stormed in with fist swinging, Aphrodite glided in with a smile that could derail entire kingdoms. She wasn't just about love in the soft, poetic sense. She embodied desire, attraction, and the messy, unpredictable chaos that comes with it. If Olympus had a reality show, Aphrodite would be the star, leaving broken hearts and dramatic confessions in her wake. Historically, Aphrodite's cult was massive. She had temples and festivals all over the Greek world, from Cyprus to Corinth, and her worship often blurred the line between sacred and sensual. In some places, she was seen as the divine embodiment of beauty and fertility, ensuring marriages thrived and cities prospered. In others, she leaned more toward raw passion, and even ritual practices that scholars still debate today. Was her worship always about romance and fertility, or did it sometimes slide into sacred sexuality? The truth is, it varied wildly depending on where you were. Quirky fact, Aphrodite wasn't originally a purely Greek invention. Many scholars believe she was heavily influenced by Near Eastern goddesses like Ishtar or Astarte, who also mixed themes of love, war, and fertility. That overlap explains why Aphrodite sometimes comes across as surprisingly fierce. Sure, she's handing out love potions and smirks, but she's also capable of starting the Trojan War over a beauty contest. Never underestimate a goddess who can weaponize charm. The debates about her origins never end. Was she born from the sea foam after Cronus lobbed his father Uranus's severed parts into the ocean? That's one myth. Another says she's the daughter of Zeus and Diane. The seafoam version is more famous and more dramatic, but both stories coexisted. Scholars argue whether the foam birth is a symbolic tale about fertility and renewal, or just the Greeks flexing their talent for bizarre storytelling. Either way, the image of Aphrodite stepping out of the waves, radiant and untouchable, became one of the most iconic scenes in mythology. And then there are the love triangles, plural. She was married to Hephaestus, the calm, awkward craftsman god, but rarely gave him the time of day. Her most infamous affair was with Ares, of course, which ended with that humiliating golden net incident. But she didn't stop there. Mortals too fell under her spell, like poor Anchises, who fathered her son Aeneas. Imagine being a humble shepherd suddenly seduced by a goddess, and then realizing you're now responsible for a future Trojan hero. Talk about pressure. Quirky detail, Aphrodite's symbols weren't just doves and roses. She also had ties to seashells, sparrows, and even goats. Yes, goats. Some myths describe sacrifices made to her with goats, a far cry from the soft pastel image we often imagine. Scholars suggest this might connect her to older fertility cults, where animals symbolized abundance and life. So next time you picture her lounging with roses, add a goat or two nibbling in the background for historical accuracy. Her power wasn't just physical beauty. Aphrodite embodied the kind of charm that makes people lose their minds, forget their duties, and rewrite entire destinies. She's the reason Paris handed her the golden apple in that beauty contest, sparking the Trojan War. Athena offered wisdom, Hera offered power, but Aphrodite offered the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris being Paris didn't think twice. That single choice changed the course of Greek myth forever. Imagine her at the Olympian banquet, draped in silks, smiling faintly while everyone else argues. Zeus slams his thunderbolts, Hera fumes, Apollo strums for attention, and Ares flexes across the table. Aphrodite doesn't need to shout. She leans back, lets the room tilt in her direction, and watches chaos unfold. Because with her, chaos was never loud. It was magnetic, slow, and irresistible. So if you picture Aphrodite as just the goddess of love, you miss half the story. She was attraction in its purest, most disruptive form, the gentle hand on your shoulder and the wildfire behind your ribs. Beautiful, yes, but dangerous too. On Olympus, where egos already burned bright, her presence was like tossing perfume onto an open flame, sweet-smelling, but guaranteed to make everything explode. After Aphrodite's effortless chaos, you might crave someone quieter, someone who doesn't start wars just by existing. That's when you hear the steady hammering echoing through Olympus, sparks flying behind a heavy door, and realize you've reached Hephaestus's forge. No glamour, no golden spotlight, just sweat, smoke, and the clang of metal on metal. Hephaestus, god of fire and craftsmanship, was the divine mechanic of the pantheon. If Zeus needed a new thunderbolt or Poseidon wanted a trident upgrade, or even if Athena decided her helmet could use more sparkle, Hephaestus was the one they called. Historically, Hephaestus represented not just fire, but the kind of fire humans could control. Blacksmith forges, hearths, and workshops. He was worshipped in cities like Athens and Lemnos, where craftsmen honoured him as the ultimate artisan. Unlike flashy gods who thrived on drama, Hephaestus had a humble, practical appeal. He built things. Without him, Olympus might not have had weapons, palaces, or even furniture for their eternal banquets. Imagine the gods eating ambrosia on bare stone floors. Pretty undignified. Quirky fact, Hephaestus was the only Olympian who wasn't conventionally beautiful. Myths describe him as lame, with twisted legs, sometimes even tossed off Olympus by Hera for being ugly. In one version, he fell for an entire day before landing on the island of Lemnos, where kind mortals nursed him. Instead of sulking forever, he built a workshop and became the greatest craftsman ever. Talk about turning rejection into a side hustle. Of course, some scholars argue whether Hera really abandoned him, or if Zeus did the tossing. Either way, Hephaestus began his divine career with a crash landing. And here's the debate. Was Hephaestus's lameness symbolic, or was it just a detail to make him stand out among the gods? Some say his impairment symbolizes the tension between physical imperfection and artistic genius. Others think it reflects real ancient blacksmiths who often suffered injuries from their work. Still others suggest it was simply a mythic quirk, because why not have one god who doesn't fit the glamorous mould? Despite his rough start, Hephaestus built wonders. He crafted Achilles' shield, Pandora's body, Hermes' winged helmet, and even mechanical servants made of gold. Imagine living on Olympus and seeing shiny robot assistants clanking through the halls, carrying nectar trays while Hephaestus wipes soot off his brow. The gods might laugh at him, but when their gear needed fixing, they lined up outside his forge like desperate customers at a genius bar. Of course, his marriage to Aphrodite didn't help his reputation. Zeus paired them up, maybe hoping to balance Aphrodite's beauty with Hephaestus's practicality. Instead, it became Olympus's most awkward relationship. Aphrodite spent more time with Ares than her husband, and when Hephaestus caught them in that golden net, he turned the tables, literally, by exposing them in front of everyone. The scene was humiliating, but also a weird flex. Hephaestus, the lame god, outsmarted two of Olympus's most glamorous figures. Sure, they laughed, but he had the last laugh when they realized he controlled the locks, the chains, and the gadgets. Another quirky tale has Hephaestus trapping Hera herself. After she cast him out, he built a golden throne and gifted it to her. But once she sat down, she couldn't get up. The throne held her prisoner. The other gods begged him to release her, but Hephaestus refused until Dionysus got him drunk and coaxed him back to Olympus. You can almost hear him slurring, "Fine, but only if she admits it was wrong to throw me off the mountain." Petty? Yes. Genius? Also yes. Imagine Hephaestus at the Olympian dinner ball. While Zeus blusters, Ares flexes, and Aphrodite smirks, Hephaestus quietly cuts his meat with utensils he invented himself, probably already thinking about redesigning the cutlery. He doesn't need to win the room, he already built the room. The walls, the chandeliers, the golden cups, those are his. And while the others laugh at his limp, they do it while drinking from goblets that came straight out of his forge. So maybe Hephaestus wasn't glamorous. Maybe he wasn't radiant like Apollo or magnetic like Aphrodite. But he was indispensable. He was proof that power doesn't always roar or sparkle. Sometimes it just clangs in the background, steady and unglamorous, building the things that let everyone else shine. Without him, Olympus would still be camping in the clouds. With him, they had palaces of firelit gold. After Hermes' blur of winged sandals and stolen snacks, the hallway of Olympus suddenly feels quieter. You step into a chamber where the fire is steady, the couches are arranged neatly, and for once no one's shouting. This is Hestia's corner, the goddess of the hearth, the literal heart of every home and temple. She isn't flashy. She doesn't thunder, seduce, or throw tantrums. She just exists, keeping the flame alive, making sure everyone else has a place to gather. If the Olympians were a dysfunctional family, Hestia was the one refilling water glasses and making sure no one forgot their coats. Historically, Hestia was one of the most important deities for ordinary people, even though she rarely got the spotlight in myths. Every Greek home had a hearth, and the first and last offering of any ritual, whether for Zeus, Athena, or even Ares, went to Hestia. She represented continuity, the flame that bound family and community together. Her cult didn't rely on giant temples, but on something much more intimate. The hearth fire everyone tended daily. In a sense, she was the most omnipresent goddess of all, even if she stayed in the background. Quirky fact, Hestia was so central that when Greek colonies were founded, settlers carried a flame from the mother city's hearth to light the new one. It was like taking a cosmic pilot light to ensure the new home was spiritually linked to the old. Imagine packing for a long voyage and thinking, wallet, sandals, oh, and don't forget the eternal fire. Practical, not exactly, symbolic, completely. Yet despite her importance, Hestia's myths are almost non-existent. Some scholars argue this was intentional. She represented stability and peace, which doesn't make for juicy storytelling. Others point out she willingly gave up her seat on the Olympian councils to Dionysus, preferring to keep the fire going rather than join in divine debates. That act alone sets her apart. Who else on Olympus ever gave up power voluntarily? You can almost hear her saying, "You guys handle the thunderbolts and scandals. I'll just keep things warm." Debates about Hestia usually revolve around why she was so neglected in surviving literature. Was she too domestic for the poets to care? Or was she so deeply woven into daily life that she didn't need mythic PR? In many ways, Hestia was the opposite of Hermes. Where he blurred boundaries and darted about, she was fixed, constant, anchoring the world with her stillness. Together, they balanced motion and home. Her virginity also sets her apart. Like Athena and Artemis, Hestia never married or engaged in Olympian romances. But unlike them, she didn't need weapons or wilderness to define her independence. She simply chose not to play the game. Myths say both Poseidon and Apollo tried to court her, but she swore an oath to remain unmarried, and Zeus respected her choice. Imagine Poseidon sulking, Apollo composing breakup ballads, and Hestia just shrugging and returning to her fire. No drama, no spectacle, just boundaries. Quirky anecdote. There was once an attempt by Priapus, a minor fertility god, to assault her while she slept. The story goes that a donkey brayed loudly, waking Hestia in time to defend herself. Instead of highlighting Priapus's power, the tale became more about how ridiculous he was, outwitted by a farm animal. You can picture Hestia brushing the dust off her robes, calmly relighting the fire, while Priapus sulked in humiliation. At an Olympian banquet, Hestia barely speaks, while Zeus thunders and Hera fumes, while Dionysus sings drunken hymns and Ares demands arm wrestling contests. Hestia quietly keeps the flame burning. She makes sure the food stays warm, that the lamps don't sputter out. The others may forget she's there, but the moment the fire dims, they all panic. Without her, Olympus's eternal feast would literally go cold. So imagine her not as a grand goddess in glittering armor or silk, but as the soft glow in the background, the steady flame you don't notice until it's gone. Hestia didn't need dramatic myths because she wasn't about spectacle. She was about comfort, continuity, and peace. On Olympus, where everyone else fought for attention, she proved that sometimes the most powerful presence is the one that stays still. From Hestia's calm glow, you step into the opposite vibe entirely. A room that smells of wine, echoes with laughter, and probably has someone snoring under the table. This is Dionysus's domain, the god of wine, theatre, and ecstatic chaos. If Hestia was the still flame, Dionysus was the spark that kept jumping out of the fire pit, landing in your drink and making you dance barefoot in the vineyard at midnight. He was the newcomer to Olympus, a late addition who shook things up like a cork popping out of a bottle. Historically, Dionysus's worship was as wild as you'd expect. His festivals, the Dionysia, involved plays, parades, masks, and plenty of drinking. He wasn't just the god of alcohol, he was the god of transformation, blurring lines between sanity and madness, reality and performance. His followers, the Maenads, were famous for rushing into the hills in ecstatic frenzy. sometimes tearing apart animals or, in darker myths, even people while shouting his name. Imagine an entire block party that slowly turns into a surreal fever dream and you're close to the Dionysian vibe. Quirky fact, Dionysus had one of the strangest birth stories on Olympus. His mother, Semele, was a mortal who asked Zeus to reveal his true godly form. Big mistake. She was incinerated instantly by divine radiance. But Zeus saved the unborn Dionysus by sewing him into his thigh until he was ready to be born. Yes, thigh pregnancy. Ancient myths didn't do subtle. You can picture the other gods side-eyeing Zeus's glowing leg for months, whispering, "Is he seriously carrying a baby in there?" Scholars debate Dionysus's origins constantly. Was he originally a foreign god imported from Thrace or Asia Minor, whose cult spread across Greece? Or was he always part of the Greek pantheon, just lurking on the margins until the myths gave him a grand entrance? His outsider vibe makes sense either way. He was always the god who arrived uninvited, brought too much wine, and somehow convinced everyone to dance until dawn. Personality-wise, Dionysus was paradoxical. On one hand, he offered joy, release, and freedom from worry. On the other, he could unleash madness, tearing down boundaries of reason and order. He was the double edge of intoxication, 1 cup of wine for warmth, 10 cups for disaster. That duality fascinated philosophers. Some saw him as dangerous, a god who dissolved social order. Others saw him as essential, a divine reminder that humans need both control and release. And the theatre, that was Dionysus's other gift. The great tragedies and comedies of Athens were performed at his festivals, dedicated to him as the god who blurred illusion and truth. The stage itself was seen as a sacred space where masks allowed mortals to channel divine emotion. Without Dionysus, no Oedipus Rex, no Medea, no stand-up comedians roasting politicians under a cover of ritual. He turned chaos into art. Quirky anecdote, Dionysus could be surprisingly cunning. In one myth, pirates kidnapped him, thinking he was a rich prince. When they tried to tie him up, the ropes fell loose. Vines sprouted from the mast, wine flooded the deck, and the terrified pirates leapt overboard, only to be turned into dolphins. You can imagine Dionysus sipping calmly on the railing, watching them splash away, thinking, "That'll teach you to mess with me." At Olympian banquets, Dionysus was both life of the party and mild catastrophe. He poured wine for everyone, sometimes too generously, then got distracted and wandered into impromptu storytelling or theatrical monologues. Apollo probably rolled his eyes at the dramatics. Hera definitely disapproved. But Zeus liked him. After all, this was the son he carried in his thigh. Proof that even divine chaos could be family. And Hestia, she eventually gave up her seat on the council to make room for him, which says a lot. So picture Dionysus not as a sloppy drunk, but as the god who knew joy and madness were two sides of the same coin. He was the cool breeze through vineyards, the laughter echoing in a theatre, the dizzying moment when the world tilts and you forget what's real. On Olympus, where control and ego ruled, Dionysus whispered that sometimes it's okay to let go, just maybe not too much. After the swirl of Dionysian chaos, you might wonder what it looks like when the entire Olympian cast gathers together. Because yes, they did occasionally attempt family dinners. Imagine a massive golden hall with couches lining the walls, ambrosia bowls steaming like eternal fondue, and nectar flowing like bottomless mimosas. In theory, it's divine harmony, gods eating, drinking, and celebrating together. In reality, it's closer to the worst holiday potluck you've ever attended, only stretched across eternity. Historically, the Greeks believed the Olympians shared feasts prepared by Hebe, the goddess of youth, or sometimes by Ganymede, Zeus's favourite cupbearer. These weren't modest meals. Ambrosia and nectar supposedly kept the gods immortal and glowing. Homer describes them eating and laughing as if their banquets were endless symphonies of joy. But if you read between the lines, or better yet, picture these gods with their oversized egos crammed into one room, you know the vibe had to be less fine dining and more extended family argument with better lighting. Quirky fact, in one myth the goddess of strife Eris wasn't invited to a wedding feast. In revenge, she tossed a golden apple onto the table inscribed "to the fairest." Instantly, Hera, Athena and Aphrodite started bickering over it. That little potluck spat snowballed into the judgment of Paris, and eventually the Trojan War, all because someone didn't make enough seating arrangements. Moral of the story: never underestimate the politics of guest lists. Scholars debate whether these Olympian feasts were meant to reflect idealized divine unity or satirical mirrors of human banquets. Did poets imagine them as flawless, or were they always slyly acknowledging that any big gathering, mortal or immortal, dissolves into side-eyes and gossip? Some argue the gods were models of aristocratic leisure, eternal wine drinkers whose feasts symbolized order. Others insist the myths reveal just how dysfunctional these so-called immortals really were. Picture the scene in detail. Zeus sits at the head, thunderbolts tucked uncomfortably under the table, pretending to be dignified while sneaking glances at every pretty mortal invited as a guest. Hera is next to him, smile tight as a drawn bowstring, watching his every move. Apollo strums a lyre in the background, trying to set a classy mood, while Dionysus keeps interrupting with toasts that get progressively sloppier. Athena sits with arms crossed, clearly unimpressed with all of it, while Ares growls, "Let's turn this into a drinking contest." Meanwhile, Hermes darts around the hall, stealing olives from platters and whispering jokes into Demeter's ear, who just wants everyone to eat in peace. Artemis keeps refusing to try the roast, muttering about respect for animals, and Poseidon sulks because someone forgot to serve seafood. Hephaestus pours wine with mechanical servants, his golden robots clanking awkwardly as they shuffle between couches, and in the corner, Hestia, quietly tending the central hearth so the food doesn't go cold while everyone else pretends not to notice. Quirky anecdote: sometimes mortals actually joined these feasts, at least in myth. Heroes like Heracles or Achilles were occasionally invited, usually as rewards for deeds, but sitting at the divine table came with risks: one slip of etiquette, one joke gone wrong, and suddenly you're the butt of an immortal grudge. Imagine being the mortal who sneezed while Zeus raised a toast. That's not just embarrassment, that's lightning bolt danger. And of course the gods didn't just argue, they also schemed. A single banquet could be the setting for Hera plotting against Zeus, Athena whispering battle strategies, or Aphrodite quietly flirting with Ares under the table. Think less Thanksgiving dinner, and more Game of Thrones, but with endless wine refills. No wonder the myths are full of quarrels that start over meals. So when you picture an Olympian potluck, don't imagine serene gods gracefully nibbling grapes. Imagine thunder booming because Zeus is tipsy, Apollo and Dionysus battling over who gets to play music, Ares flipping the table after losing a drinking contest, and Hera sighing into her goblet. The feast might look divine from a distance, but up close it was just another family dinner, louder, longer, and immortal. By now you've probably noticed that Olympian dinners were less about harmony and more about who could out-petty the other. Welcome to the world of rivalries and grudges, the divine equivalent of a group chat where nobody ever leaves, and everyone has receipts from centuries ago. On Olympus nothing was forgotten. If someone insulted your sacred tree, or won a city you wanted, or, turned you into a spider, looking at you, Athena, you were absolutely going to bring it up at the next banquet. Historically, these rivalries served a purpose. The Greeks didn't see their gods as flawless paragons, but as larger-than-life reflections of themselves. By showing the gods bickering, sulking, and holding grudges, myths explained why life felt so messy. If crops failed or storms wrecked ships, maybe it wasn't just chance. Maybe Demeter was still mayor, or Poseidon lost another popularity contest. It was a divine blame game, and mortals were stuck living with the fallout. Quirky fact: Hera and Zeus's marital squabbles were practically Olympian theatre. Hera tried more than once to overthrow him, even banding together with Athena and Poseidon in a divine coup. They chained Zeus in his bed, only for him to break free later, furious. Imagine a roommate mutiny where everyone ties up the loudest guy in the house, then regrets it instantly when he storms loose with lightning bolts. Awkward breakfasts after that one. Scholars debate whether these rivalries were meant to be comedic or moralizing. Were the myths poking fun at the gods' inability to get along, showing audiences that even immortals can't escape drama? Or were they cautionary tales about what happens when pride and jealousy run unchecked? Some even suggest the rivalries reflected real political tensions between city-states, each projecting their own local loyalties onto Olympian conflicts. Take Athena versus Poseidon, that olive tree versus salty spring contest for Athens. It wasn't just about civic pride. For centuries, Athens defined itself by Athena's gift, while Poseidon lingered in the background as the god who lost. Did the Athenians mock Poseidon in plays? Absolutely. Did Spartans who worshipped him clap back? Of course, the god's grudges doubled as civic propaganda, eternalized in marble and myth. Another famous rivalry, Aphrodite and Hera never saw eye to eye. Hera, queen of respectable marriages, wasn't thrilled with Aphrodite's endless affairs and scandalous behaviour. Meanwhile, Aphrodite probably rolled her eyes at Hera's constant nagging. Throw Athena into the mix, who despised both love and domestic drama, and you've got the ultimate mean girl triangle. No wonder Eris's golden apple sparked chaos. They were all already waiting for an excuse, and don't forget Apollo and Hermes. Their relationship that started with that whole cattle theft fiasco and evolved into a lifetime of snark. Apollo thought he was the refined, radiant god of order, while Hermes was the cheeky little brother always pranking him. Imagine Apollo practicing a serious lyre performance, only for Hermes to cut the strings and replace them with goat guts. Not exactly sibling harmony. Quirky anecdote, even mortals weren't safe from these rivalries. Paris, the Trojan prince, got dragged into the goddess's beauty contest and ended up dooming his entire city. Poor guy just wanted a quiet life tending sheep, but instead he had to choose between Hera's promise of power, Athena's offer of wisdom, and Aphrodite's bribe of Helen. He picked Aphrodite, of course, because mortals rarely make wise decisions in myths. 10 years of war later, you'd think he'd regret it. Imagine an Olympian banquet with all this simmering in the background. Zeus tries to look authoritative while side-eyeing Hera. Athena refuses to make eye contact with Poseidon. Aphrodite laughs sweetly while glaring daggers at Hera. Apollo strums louder every time Hermes whispers a joke. Dionysus pours wine, hoping the alcohol will keep everyone distracted. And Hestia in the corner is probably thinking, if they'd just eaten and stopped talking, we could all get through this. So when you think about divine rivalries, don't picture grand cosmic battles. Picture immortal siblings in a never-ending feud dragging mortals into their arguments, and holding grudges longer than the lifespan of entire empires. For gods who could live forever, patience was not their strong suit. They might forgive eventually, but forgetting? Not a chance. If the Olympians were content to stew in their own rivalries, that would be one thing. But they had a nasty habit of dragging mortals into their drama, often with disastrous results. To the gods, humans were playthings, pawns, or occasionally side characters in their eternal soap opera. And the mortals? Well, they didn't really get a choice. If Zeus wanted to date you, or Hera wanted to curse you, or Athena decided to test your weaving skills, congratulations, you just became part of divine family therapy. Historically, Greek myths blurred the line between mortal and divine constantly. Heroes like Perseus, Heracles, and Achilles were all demigods, the product of Olympians wandering a little too often outside their marriage vows. Cities claimed descent from gods to boost their prestige, and festivals reenacted myths where mortals played along with divine narratives. To ancient audiences, it wasn't just entertainment, it was a way of explaining why life sometimes felt like the whims of cosmic roommates you couldn't escape. Quirky fact, Zeus had so many mortal affairs that entire regions traced their founders back to him. Europa, abducted by Zeus in bull form, gave her name to a continent. Danae, visited as Golden Rain, gave birth to Perseus. Leda, approached as a swan, hatched eggs that produced Helen of Troy. It's almost comical how often Zeus went full costume department just to romance someone. Imagine living in Greece, hearing thunder, and wondering if Zeus was sneaking off again in disguise as your neighbour's horse. Scholars debate whether these stories were meant to glorify Zeus's power or subtly criticise it. Was he admired as the great progenitor of heroes, or mocked as an incorrigible wanderer who couldn't keep his toga tied? Some argue these myths symbolise fertility and divine blessing. Others see them as satirical commentary on aristocrats who behave the same way. Either way, mortals caught in Zeus's attention rarely had happy endings. Take poor Semele, mother of Dionysus. She believed Zeus loved her, but wanted proof of his divinity. When she demanded to see him in his true form, she was vaporized. Or Callisto, one of Artemis's followers, who was seduced or assaulted by Zeus and then transformed into a bear, eventually tossed into the sky as the constellation Ursa Major. For mortals, divine attention was like winning the worst lottery imaginable. The prize was a short, tragic life and maybe a constellation named after you. And it wasn't just Zeus. Hera, forever suspicious, often punished mortals who had the misfortune of being his lovers or children. Heracles spent his life battling monsters because Hera cursed him from birth. Io, a mortal priestess, was turned into a cow by Zeus to hide her from Hera, only for Hera to send a gadfly to torment her endlessly. Imagine grazing in a field as a cow while swatting away divine insects. An eternal cosmic prank. Athena also meddled with mortals, though in a more cerebral way. She helped heroes like Odysseus with clever strategies, but also destroyed Arachne for daring to rival her weaving. Apollo cursed Cassandra with true prophecy that nobody would believe just because she wouldn't sleep with him. Artemis, furious at Agamemnon for killing a sacred deer, demanded the sacrifice of his daughter Iphigenia before allowing the Trojan expedition to sail. The Olympians weren't exactly subtle. Obey or suffer. Quirky anecdote. Sometimes mortals tried to fight back. Bellerophon, hero of Corinth, attempted to fly Pegasus up to Olympus itself. Zeus swatted him down, sending him crashing back to Earth, blind and disgraced. It's a myth scholars still debate. Was it about punishing hubris, or simply reminding everyone that humans don't get VIP passes to divine banquets? Either way, mortals learned quickly. Keep your head down unless you want it turned into a moral lesson. Picture an Olympian dinner after one of these incidents. Zeus shrugs. So I turned another girl into a constellation. Hera fumes. Do you ever stop? Apollo smirks. At least mine inspire music, while Athena insists. Mine become examples of discipline. Meanwhile, Dionysus raises his cup and toasts all the mortals caught in the crossfire, half sympathetic, half entertained. And the mortals themselves? Well, they're somewhere on Earth, staring at the stars, wondering why their great-great-grandmother is now a bear. So if you imagine the Olympians as benevolent gods gently guiding humanity, think again. They were intrusive neighbours with infinite power and zero boundaries, barging into mortal lives whenever they got bored. Mortals were pawns in divine grudges, test subjects for godly experiments, and sometimes unwilling parents of heroes destined to die young. It was dangerous to catch a god's eye, but it was even more dangerous to ignore them. If you survived the meddling of the gods, you still had to deal with their sense of style. And wow, did they lean hard into the drama of divine fashion. Forget togas as plain sheets. Olympian wardrobes were exaggerated, glittering, and sometimes hilariously impractical. Imagine flowing robes that shimmered like dawn, golden belts that could sway entire battles, and helmets so ornate they probably weighed more than the person wearing them. If Olympus had a runway, every dinner could have doubled as Fashion Week. Historically, the Greeks pictured their gods dressed like idealized aristocrats. Fine robes, gleaming armor, and jewelry. Depictions on pottery and statues always emphasized elegance. Athena's armor never had a dent. Apollo's robes always draped perfectly, and Aphrodite looked like she'd just stepped out of a seafoam spa. The gods were basically the original influencers, each with a curated look that mortals imitated in rituals and festivals. Quirky fact, Aphrodite owned a magical accessory called the Girdle of Desire. Whenever she wore it, she became irresistible, even to other gods. Hera once borrowed it to distract Zeus so she could scheme behind his back. Imagine sharing your best outfit with a frenemy, only for her to use it to manipulate your husband. Ancient myths really were just soap operas with better wardrobes. Scholars debate whether these clothing details were symbolic or just creative flair from storytellers. Did Athena's shining aegis, a shield or breastplate with Medusa's head on it, represent real armor traditions, or was it purely mythic imagery? Was Hermes' winged cap inspired by actual travelers' gear, or was it just a flashy way to explain how he zipped between realms? The answer may be both. Myths often blended real cultural objects with exaggerated divine bling. Take Zeus. He often wore a simple royal robe but always paired it with a thunderbolt accessory, because apparently being king of the gods wasn't enough without carrying an eternal neon "Do not mess with me" sign. Poseidon went for a sea aesthetic, flowing blue-green robes, dripping wet hair, and that ever-present trident. Imagine showing up to a party always dripping like you just came from the pool. Stylish or just damp, depends on your perspective. Apollo, of course, leaned toward glam. Golden laurel crowns, shining robes, and that lyre slung casually across his shoulder. He was the type who'd vow, "Oh, this old thing," while wearing a robe stitched with literal starlight. His twin Artemis went the opposite direction. Short tunics for running, boots for hunting, and a bow always at her side. She was functional chic, more REI catalogue than haute couture. Quirky anecdote, Dionysus was known for showing up in costumes that blurred gender lines. Flowing robes, ivy crowns, sometimes even dressing like a mortal woman to travel unnoticed. His cult embraced masks and costumes too, breaking down social norms. Scholars still discuss whether his fashion was purely symbolic of transformation, or if it reflected real ritual practices where men and women cross-dressed during his festivals. Either way, Dionysus knew how to keep everyone guessing. And don't forget the wardrobe malfunctions. In some myths, gods disguised themselves as mortals and got the details hilariously wrong. Zeus's animal costumes we've covered, but even when gods put on human clothes, they couldn't always resist overdoing it. Picture Hermes trying to blend in as a shepherd, only his sandals still have wings, and he's carrying a staff glowing faintly in the dark. Mortals probably just nodded politely, pretending not to notice. At the Olympian banquet, fashion was half the entertainment. Aphrodite twirls in a gown shimmering like dawn. Athena adjusts her perfectly polished helmet, daring anyone to comment on whether armour counts as dinner attire. Hera wears her peacock-feathered crown glaring at Zeus across the table. Dionysus spills wine on his robe and just shrugs, declaring it a new style. And Hestia? She's in the same simple dress as always, unbothered, tending the fire while everyone else fusses over their accessories. So when you picture Olympian gods, don't think of bland, shapeless robes. Think of them as runway-ready divas, dripping with symbolism, each outfit a statement. Their wardrobes weren't just about looking good. They were about power, identity, and sometimes revenge. Because on Olympus, even fashion wasn't safe from divine drama. After watching the gods strut around in their impractical wardrobes, you might wonder how they kept track of all their kids, and the short answer is, they didn't. The Olympian family tree was less of a neat chart and more of a sprawling bramble patch, with Zeus at the centre, scribbling names on sticky notes and Hera tearing them down in a rage. Mortals, demigods, nymphs, monsters, you name it. Someone was probably related to the king of the gods. If you thought your family reunions were messy, imagine explaining to a room full of cousins that half of you are technically thunderstorms. Historically, these tangled genealogies mattered a lot. Cities traced their founders back to divine parents to claim legitimacy. Heroes weren't just brave, they were blood relatives of gods. That gave them authority, prestige, and a story that tied them directly to Olympus. If you could say, my great-grandfather was Zeus, you suddenly had the right to rule, or at least brag loudly at festivals. It was ancient name-dropping at its finest. Quirky fact, Zeus had so many children that ancient writers struggled to keep lists straight. By some counts, he fathered over 100 offspring, ranging from gods like Athena, born from his forehead, to heroes like Perseus and Heracles, to entire lineages of kings and queens. Some myths even overlap, with two different towns claiming the same child as their own local founder. Imagine Zeus trying to keep track. Wait, was that Perseus of Argos or Perseus of Tiryns? Whatever, they're all mine. Scholars debate how much of this is metaphor and how much was just narrative convenience. Was Zeus's prolific parenting meant to symbolize the spread of divine influence across Greece? Or was it just a way for storytellers to connect every hero back to Olympus? Some argue it was propaganda, cities boosting their clout by claiming divine ancestry. Others think it was just lazy storytelling. If you needed a dad for your hero, Zeus was the easiest option. But Zeus wasn't the only one complicating the family tree. Poseidon had his share of children too, like the Cyclops Polyphemus, who famously got outwitted by Odysseus. Then there were the sea nymphs and monstrous offspring who filled out Poseidon's corner of the chart. Aphrodite had kids like Eros, whose arrows caused more chaos than any thunderbolt. Ares and Aphrodite's union produced Phobos and Deimos, fear and terror, because of course it did. Even Hera, usually the jealous one, had a few children of her own, including Hephaestus, whom she may have birthed solo out of spite. That's one way to win an argument. See? I don't need you, Zeus. Quirky anecdote. Hera also gave birth to Typhon in some versions, a fire-breathing monster so massive his head brushed the stars. If true, that would make family reunions even stranger. Imagine introducing Typhon to Athena. Hi, this is your brother. Don't mind the 100 snakeheads, he's family. It's like seating Godzilla at Thanksgiving and pretending everything's fine. The debates extend to Persephone too. Was she Zeus's daughter with Demeter, or was she a purely agricultural figure later woven into the family tree? Different regions told different versions, leaving scholars scratching their heads. The Olympian tree isn't so much a chart as a scribbled web, constantly redrawn to suit whoever was telling the story. At an Olympian banquet, the genealogy jokes write themselves. Apollo brags about being Zeus's favourite son until Hermes pipes up, "Actually, that's me." Heracles bursts in, claiming a chair as another illegitimate demigod. Hera sighs, muttering, "Another one?" while Zeus just raises a goblet and says, "Family is everything." Meanwhile, Athena rolls her eyes because technically she has no mother, and Dionysus pours more wine because family drama pairs best with alcohol. So if you picture the Olympians as a tidy family, erase that thought immediately. They were a sprawling dynasty of gods, demigods, monsters, and mortals, all tangled together like a grapevine no one ever pruned. Zeus may have been the root, but the branches reached everywhere, across the seas, into every city, onto every battlefield. And for mortals, being related to him was both a blessing and a curse. After untangling the Olympian family tree, branches snapping, sticky notes flying, you might wonder what the gods did when they weren't feasting, fighting, or meddling in mortal love lives. Believe it or not, they took vacations. Not all-inclusive resort vacations, but divine field trips to favourite mortal hangouts, caves, rivers, and islands, where they could stir up trouble or just relax away from Olympus's eternal drama. Think of it as gods on holiday, complete with disguises and impulsive decisions. Historically, sanctuaries scattered across Greece claimed that the gods had once visited, lounged, or even lived there for a season. Delphi wasn't just Apollo's temple, it was supposedly the site he loved enough to build his oracle. Demeter wandered Eleusis in her grief, making it sacred ground. Artemis roamed the forests of Arcadia. By tying gods to real locations, cities boosted their prestige, like putting up a plaque that reads, "Yes, Athena stopped here once. You're welcome." Quirky fact, Poseidon apparently loved to crash weddings. In one myth, he attended the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, a mortal-immortal pair, and brought along his stormy vibes. That's the same event Eris ruined with the Golden Apple, sparking the Trojan War. So a divine vacation guest list ended up reshaping mythic history. Moral of the story, if the gods show up to your party, maybe don't serve apples. Scholars debate whether these vacation myths reflected actual pilgrimages. Were stories of gods travelling meant to explain why sacred sites existed across Greece, or were they simply ways of justifying why a small town deserved a temple? Some argue the wandering tales reflect older, pre-Olympian cults being folded into the Olympian framework. Others think the stories show how gods weren't stuck on Olympus. They were mobile, embedded in every stream, cave, and mountain pass, and the vacations weren't always glamorous. Dionysus wandered foreign lands, spreading wine and theatre, often rejected until he proved his divinity by driving whole towns mad. Hermes darted everywhere so fast his vacations probably blurred into errands. Aphrodite preferred seaside retreats, stepping gracefully out of the surf like she was perpetually on a beach holiday. Artemis avoided cities entirely, camping in forests, her version of glamping with deer and nymphs. Meanwhile, Hades almost never left the underworld, but when he did, well, that's how Persephone's abduction happened. Quirky anecdote, sometimes these trips doubled as pranks. When Apollo was banished from Olympus as punishment, he took a working vacation and served as a shepherd for King Admetus. Imagine the radiant god of light, lyre in hand, sulking in a pasture while sheep bleated at him. Strangely enough, he didn't hate it. Myths say he actually grew fond of Admetus and his family, showing a softer side rarely seen in his usual sunlit ego trips. At an Olympian banquet, vacation stories probably became humble brags. Apollo strums, "Ah yes, Delphi, my favourite getaway." Artemis cuts in, "Try the Arcadian woods, no mortals to bother you." Poseidon slams his goblet, boasting about sunken palaces and coral thrones. Hermes laughs about sneaking into markets, stealing pastries for fun. Dionysus waves his ivy crown, proclaiming, "Everywhere I go becomes a vacation." Hera just mutters that none of them know how to sit still, while Hestia shrugs. Her vacation was literally staying home by the fire. For mortals, these divine wanderings explained why every corner of Greece felt sacred. A cave wasn't just a cave, It was where Zeus hid as a baby. A river wasn't just water, it was where a nymph once wept into eternity. The gods left footprints everywhere, vacations doubling as origin stories. Whether or not the gods really needed a break from Olympus, their wanderlust tied them forever to the mortal world. So imagine Olympus as home base but never confinement. The gods roamed whenever they pleased, leaving traces behind like tourists with infinite time and power. Sometimes they brought blessings, other times curses, but always stories. Their vacations weren't about rest. They were about making sure no human ever forgot they could show up, anywhere, anytime, uninvited and unstoppable. If the Olympians' vacations sound like a lot of work disguised as leisure, that's because work-life balance wasn't really a thing for them. Mortals could divide their days into farming, feasting and sleeping, but the gods? They were always on call thunderstorms, failed crops, unlucky sailors, love triangles, surprise births of demigods. It all came knocking at their golden doors, and the Olympians rarely clocked out. Imagine being immortal with infinite PTO, but never actually getting to use it. Historically, myths don't describe the gods having jobs in the modern sense, but each one had a portfolio they couldn't escape. Poseidon couldn't take a break from the seas any more than Demeter could stop the grain from sprouting. Apollo had to keep the sun moving across the sky every day, while Artemis lit up the nights. Even Dionysus, the party god, had responsibilities. Festivals to bless, vineyards to watch, entire cities to intoxicate. The whole setup sounds divine, but it was eternal customer service without holidays. Quirky fact, Apollo wasn't thrilled about his daily commute with the sun chariot. In some myths, Helios, the older sun titan, handled the actual driving, but Apollo often got the credit. Imagine being permanently mistaken for your cousin at work. To keep the cycle of day and night consistent, somebody had to get up, grab the reins, and make sure the horses didn't veer off and set the earth on fire. Spoiler, sometimes they did. Phaethon, Apollo's mortal son, once tried to drive the chariot and nearly burned the planet to a crisp before Zeus zapped him. Bring Your Kid to Work Day went horribly wrong. Scholars debate whether these endless tasks were meant to symbolize cosmic order or just narrative devices to explain natural cycles. Was Demeter's grief a metaphor for winter? Was Apollo's chariot just a way of describing the sun's path? Or were these jobs actual duties in the mythic imagination, things the gods couldn't escape even if they wanted to? Some argue the gods were bound by fate just like mortals, only with better perks. For the gods, mixing work and play was second nature. Aphrodite caused wars while technically just doing her love goddess job. Hermes blurred the line between delivering messages and stealing wallets for fun. Athena gave wisdom but couldn't resist flexing on mortals like Arachne. Their duties were never separate from their personalities. They lived their work and sometimes they weaponized it. Quirky anecdote. Hephaestus's overtime was legendary. When Hera once begged him to craft a magical chair, he designed it to trap her the moment she sat down. Was that divine artistry or malicious workplace mischief? Either way, he never got written up. In fact, Zeus had to bribe him back into the family fold with wine and flattery. Work-life balance for Hephaestus meant blurring the line between revenge plots and carpentry projects. At an Olympian dinner, this tension was always there. Zeus boasted about keeping the skies in order. Hera reminded him how often she had to pick up the slack. And Apollo strummed his lyre while casually mentioning he'd just finished another sun run. Poseidon complained about sailors who never sacrificed properly, while Demeter muttered about humans wasting good grain. Dionysus, tipsy, raised his cup. At least my job is fun. Hestia simply tended the fire, her eternal shift that never ended, never faltered. For mortals, this lack of separation made sense. The gods weren't distant bureaucrats, they were forces of nature. You didn't pray to a 9-to-5 manager, you prayed to the sun itself, the ocean, the storm, the seed sprouting in your field. Work and life blurred because for the Greeks, existence itself was divine labour. So when you think of the Olympians lounging endlessly on Olympus, sipping nectar without responsibility, remember, every thunderclap, every sunrise, every harvest was a reminder that their work never stopped. For better or worse, the gods were always on duty, never clocking out, never truly free from their roles. Immortality didn't mean vacation, it meant eternity on the job. If being immortal meant working without vacations, it also meant dealing with boredom on a scale mortals can't even imagine. You can only throw so many thunderbolts bless so many olive groves, or crash so many weddings before the novelty wears off. For the Olympians, boredom often turned into creativity, or chaos. When the gods got restless, the world below felt it, because their idea of fun usually translated into someone's about to have a very bad day. Historically, myths are full of moments where gods acted less like rulers of the cosmos and more like pranksters, poking at humans just to see what would happen. Some of the biggest monsters in Greek mythology were byproducts of divine boredom. The Chimera, the Hydra, even the Sphinx. These creatures weren't just accidents, they were diversions, distractions, something for heroes to clean up while gods lounged above. Imagine gods treating the mortal world like a board game, tossing in new obstacles whenever things got too quiet. Quirky fact, Hera once created the monster Typhon, a fire-breathing giant with serpents for legs, because she was tired of Zeus's endless parade of children. If Zeus could make demigods every other Tuesday, Hera figured she could make a nightmare of her own. Typhon rampaged so wildly that even the gods fled in terror, disguising themselves as animals to escape. Apollo turned into a raven, Artemis into a cat, Dionysus into a goat. It was basically the first furry convention. Eventually, Zeus trapped Typhon under Mount Etna, but not before learning that his wife's idea of a hobby was apocalyptic monster design. Scholars debate how seriously the Greeks took these monster stories. Were they metaphors for natural disasters, like volcanic eruptions or plagues, or were they just colourful storytelling to entertain festival crowds? Some argue Typhon's fiery breath was an explanation for volcanic smoke. Others suggest these beasts symbolise the untamed chaos the gods barely kept at bay. Either way, they often popped up when gods seemed too bored to mind their own business. Pranks were another outlet. Hermes, as usual, took the crown for mischief. He stole Apollo's cattle on day one of his life, but he didn't stop there. He loved tripping mortals, moving boundary stones, and whispering ideas that got heroes into trouble. Even Apollo wasn't immune. Hermes once swapped out his brother's sacred tools just to watch the meltdown. Imagine being Apollo, radiant god of order, only to find your golden bow missing because your trickster half-brother thought it would be funny. Quirky anecdote. The gods sometimes turned boredom into contests. They competed over music, beauty, even architecture. Apollo challenged the satyr Marsyas to a music duel, only to flay him alive when he lost. Athena and Poseidon fought over who could gift Athens the better present. Even Zeus, supposedly dignified, got caught up in these games, stacking his thunderbolts against Poseidon's waves just to prove who could wreck more mortals in one afternoon. At an Olympian banquet, this boredom spilled over into table games. Picture Zeus flicking lightning bolts at passing clouds, Poseidon trying to outdo him by slamming goblets into miniature tsunamis, and Dionysus turning spilled wine into dancing grapevines. Hera probably scowled at the mess, while Hestia sighed and kept the fire steady. Hermes darted under the table, stealing olives and replacing them with pebbles just to watch Ares explode in confusion. If eternity was long, at least they knew how to keep themselves entertained. For mortals, divine boredom was terrifying. A god's idle prank could ruin a family, topple a city, or unleash a plague. But it also meant new myths, new stories, new explanations for why life felt unpredictable. Boredom wasn't just divine restlessness. It was fuel for legends, disasters, and the constant reminder that the gods were never as far away as you hoped. So when you think of Olympus as a serene palace of perfect beings, don't. Picture it as a never-ending dormitory where immortals, trapped with infinite time, created monsters, played pranks, and set off chain reactions that shaped human history, all because they couldn't stand being bored. If pranks and monster-making weren't enough to break the monotony, the Olympians had another favourite pastime: disguises. For some reason, gods who could glow like the sun or shake the earth still felt the need to put on terrible costumes and sneak among mortals, and not just casual disguises like throwing on a hat. They went full drama club with it. Swans, bulls, beggars, shepherds, misty clouds. No outfit was too weird for an Olympian trying to meddle unnoticed. Spoiler, mortals usually noticed. Historically, divine disguises played a big role in myth. The Greeks didn't see gods as distant, untouchable beings. They believed their deities could show up in daily life, sometimes in human form, sometimes in stranger guises. Temples even warned worshippers to treat every guest kindly, because you never knew when the ragged traveller knocking on your door was Zeus in disguise, testing your hospitality. In a society that valued zinnia, sacred guest friendship, this wasn't just theatre, it was divine quality control. Quirky fact: Zeus was the undisputed champion of costumes, and not in a good way. He turned into a bull to abduct Europa, a swan to pursue Leda, and a shower of golden rain to reach Danae in her locked tower. Each disguise was more absurd than the last. Scholars debate whether these stories were metaphors for natural phenomena: bull equals storm, swan equals fertility, rain equals life-giving crops, or just excuses for Zeus's relentless romantic escapades. Either way, mortals probably looked at the next passing cow with deep suspicion. But Zeus wasn't alone in his disguise hobby. Athena often showed up to heroes in the guise of an old man, a friend, or even a bird. Odysseus practically had her on speed dial, and she never arrived in the same form twice. Hera also liked disguises, usually to spy on Zeus or mess with mortals. In one myth, she borrowed Aphrodite's magical girdle, then disguised herself to seduce Zeus and distract him while she schemed. Imagine the queen of the gods rummaging through Olympus's divine costume closet, muttering, "No, that toga makes me look suspicious." Scholars debate how literal the ancients took these transformations. Did they believe the gods physically became animals and strangers, or did they see it as poetic storytelling? Some suggest these disguises symbolize the unpredictability of divine presence, gods appearing in forms humans could handle. Others argue the transformations were simply mythic humor, exaggerations meant to entertain. Either way, they were a consistent reminder. The gods were always watching, often in ridiculous outfits. Quirky anecdote: Hermes naturally excelled at disguises. He could slip into the form of a shepherd, a traveller, or a merchant without missing a beat. Unlike Zeus's over-the-top costumes, Hermes blended in too well, the divine equivalent of that guy you didn't notice at the bus stop. Imagine him swapping cloaks mid-conversation just to see if anyone noticed. Of all the Olympians, Hermes probably had the most fun in mortal drag. At an Olympian banquet, you can almost picture them swapping stories about their disguises like actors after a play. Zeus boasting, "The swan worked perfectly." Hera snapping, "Oh please, they saw right through you." Athena smirking, "I actually helped Odysseus win a war dressed as a random sailor." Dionysus, tipsy as ever, chiming in, "One time I showed up as a vine." Nobody complained. Even Hestia might roll her eyes, too dignified to stoop to costumes, though secretly amused. For mortals, the disguise habit was both a warning and a comfort. Any beggar could be a god in disguise, so hospitality mattered. Any odd animal encounter could be divine, so treat it with respect. It kept people humble, cautious, and always aware that the divine might be hiding in plain sight. So when you imagine Olympus's rulers, don't picture them always sitting on shining thrones. Picture them rifling through a cosmic dress-up box, slipping into swan feathers, shepherd's cloaks, or shimmery mist, then striding off to meddle in mortal lives, half prank, half test, and entirely unnecessary. After hearing about all the gods' disguises, you might wonder, how much of this did the ancient Greeks actually believe, and how much was just storytelling flair? The truth is, scholars have been shrugging over that question for centuries. Myths weren't just bedtime stories, but they also weren't holy scripture in the way later religions treated sacred texts. They floated somewhere in between, part entertainment, part explanation, part cultural glue. And the Olympians? They were as much symbols as they were characters. Historically, belief in the gods varied widely. A farmer in Boeotia might genuinely pray to Demeter for his wheat harvest, while an Athenian intellectual might discuss Zeus in purely metaphorical terms at a symposium. Myths had layers. To some, they were literal truth. To others, allegories. To others still, just juicy gossip about the divine. The flexibility of belief was part of what kept Greek religion alive for so long. It could bend without breaking. Quirky fact: some philosophers openly mocked the Olympian stories. Xenophanes, a 6th century BCE thinker, complained that if cows and horses had gods, they'd draw them looking like cows and horses. He pointed out the obvious: humans made their gods in their own image, right down to the pettiness and family drama. Meanwhile, Plato suggested myths should be censored for children, because stories of Zeus cheating and Hera scheming weren't exactly moral role models. Imagine Plato as the grumpy teacher banning comic books for being too rowdy. The scholarly debate hasn't stopped since. Were myths meant to be taken literally, Or were they teaching stories, symbolic explanations of natural forces, morality, and human experience? Some argue Zeus was never meant to be a real guy on a cloud, but the embodiment of the sky itself. Others suggest that for many ordinary people, the line between metaphor and reality wasn't important. They didn't ask, do I literally believe this? They asked, does this story explain why things happen, and does it connect me to the gods? And then there's the debate about myth versus ritual. Did people invent rituals based on myths, or did myths grow to explain existing rituals? For example, Demeter's Eleusinian mysteries promised initiates a better fate after death, but the actual rites were secret. Scholars wonder if the story of Persephone's abduction was created to explain those rituals, or if the rituals existed first and the story came later. It's a chicken and egg problem that still makes historians squint. Quirky anecdote, some towns even told versions of myths that contradicted each other, and nobody panicked about it. In one place, Athena was born from Zeus's head. In another, she washed up on shore fully grown. In one story, Dionysus was born from Zeus's thigh. In another, he was born from Semele and raised in secret. Myths weren't fixed canon. They were remix culture, evolving with every storyteller. Imagine Marvel rebooting Spider-Man every few decades, and you'll understand how Greeks felt about their gods' origin stories. At an Olympian banquet, if you asked the gods what people believed about them, they'd probably laugh. Zeus might smirk. Some mortals think I'm just the sky. Hera would scoff, and yet they still build me temples. Apollo might strum a tune, insisting his oracle made mortals believe whatever he wanted. Athena would arch an eyebrow. Belief is less important than action. Dionysus would just raise his cup and say, they believe enough to party. So when you picture ancient Greeks listening to these myths, don't imagine rigid doctrine. Imagine layers of meaning, literal for some, metaphorical for others, entertaining for all. The stories were flexible, shifting with time, place and purpose, and that flexibility made the Olympians less like dogma and more like living theatre, performances retold endlessly, shaping and reshaping how humans thought about the divine. By now, you've wandered through every noisy corridor of Olympus, past Zeus's thunderbolts, Hera's side eyes, Poseidon's tantrums, Athena's strategy sessions, and Dionysus's wine-stained stage. But the final thing to know about these gods isn't how they lived, it's how they faded. For all their immortality, the Olympians didn't stay at the centre of human imagination forever. Time ironically wore them down, not by killing them, but by letting people quietly move on. Historically, the shift came gradually. By the 4th century BCE, philosophers like Plato and Aristotle were already critiquing the gods, treating them as allegories rather than literal beings. When Alexander the Great spread Greek culture across Asia, the Olympians mingled with foreign deities, blending and reshaping their stories. And later, as Rome adopted the pantheon and renamed the gods, Zeus becoming Jupiter, Aphrodite becoming Venus, they transformed again, not dying but being rebranded for new audiences. Quirky fact, even when Christianity rose and replaced Greek religion as the official faith of the Roman Empire, the Olympians didn't vanish completely. People still told their stories, now as old myths, instead of living religion. Temples crumbled, or were converted into churches, but statues of Athena and Apollo sometimes just got new names, repurposed as saints or symbols. Imagine being a god, once worshipped with sacrifices, now mistaken for garden decor. Immortality has a sense of humour. Scholars debate how sudden or gentle this decline was. Some argue the Olympians died quickly once monotheism took root, their cults outlawed and their temples abandoned. Others see a softer fade, country folk continuing small rituals in secret, myths surviving as entertainment, not doctrine. Maybe the gods didn't vanish so much as drift into the background, slipping into literature, art and memory. If immortality means being remembered, then in some way they've never left. And yet their stories still feel alive. Modern retellings, from Shakespeare to comic books, recycle their scandals, rivalries and adventures. Ares pops up as a villain, Aphrodite as a muse, Hermes as a trickster sidekick. The Olympians slipped out of temples and into culture itself, haunting stage plays, paintings and bedtime stories like this one. You could argue they traded worshippers for fans, sacrifices for subscription. Picture the last Olympian banquet. Zeus raises his goblet, sighing, "Remember when mortals actually prayed to us?" Hera mutters, "They pray to someone else now." Apollo strums quietly, his sun still rising out of habit. Athena shrugs. "At least they study me in classrooms." Dionysus laughs, spilling wine. "I'm still at every party, trust me." Hermes zips past, whispering, "They don't call us gods anymore, but they still tell our stories." And in the corner, Hestia keeps the fire glowing, a reminder that some flames never truly go out. So the Olympians didn't vanish. They shifted from rulers of rituals to icons of imagination. Their thrones may be empty, their temples in ruins, but they still linger in the way we talk about love, war, jealousy, wisdom, and chaos. They were always reflections of us, and as long as humans wrestle with those same forces, the gods will stay, half remembered, half reinvented, fully immortal. And now, after 30 Olympian detours, thunderclaps, wine spills, and a suspicious number of swans, we finally let the curtain fall on Mount Olympus. You've tiptoed through a palace that was less divine perfection and more eternal family reunion, complete with arguments, side-eyes, and way too much nectar. If you've made it this far awake, you deserve ambrosia, or at least a midnight snack from your own kitchen. But hopefully, you're already drifting, eyelids heavy, letting the noise of the gods dissolve into something softer. Think about how strange it is that these myths, told thousands of years ago under starlit skies, still wander through our heads. Farmers once whispered prayers to Demeter before planting seeds. Sailors once poured wine to Poseidon before setting sail. Lovers once sighed Aphrodite's name into the night. And now you've heard their stories, not as solemn rituals, but as background music for falling asleep. The gods haven't vanished. They've just traded temples for bedtime company. Imagine Olympus going quiet for the evening. Zeus sets down his thunderbolts for once. Hera stops glaring. Apollo closes his lyre case, and Artemis leans back under her moon. Dionysus snores softly in a corner, wine cup still in hand. Hermes finally sits still, wings folding. Hestia's fire glows steady in the hearth, warm and calm, filling the hall with silence. Even immortals must rest, at least in the imagination. So as you lie there, breathing slow, let the drama fade into the background. No thunder, no storms, no monsters prowling the edges of the world. Just the hush of history turning into dream. The gods will still be there tomorrow, messy as ever, but for now you can leave them behind. Close your eyes. The stories are done. The fire is warm. Sleep.